For 10,000 years, the Draconian Empire has conquered without mercy. They have burned worlds. They have enslaved billions. And they have never, not once, failed to achieve their objectives. The Draconians are ancient. Their armored scales have been hardened by millennia of war. Their minds are cold logic wrapped in predatory instinct. They are the apex hunters of the galactic stage. When they decide a world belongs to them, that world belongs to them. And they had decided Earth would be theirs. Admiral Varkon stood at the observation deck of the Dominion's Fong, the largest warship ever constructed. Beneath him, the fleet arranged itself in perfect military formation. 200 capital ships, each bristling with enough firepower to vaporize a continent. Behind them, countless fighters, cruisers, and support vessels stretched across the void like a swarm of locusts, black against the infinite dark. Earth was 3 rotations away. The admiral's scaled face twisted into something approaching a smile, though a human observer might have seen only the expression of a reptile contemplating its prey. His deep voice rumbled across the comm system to his war council. "They have reached out into the stars," he said, almost amused. "These soft creatures. They call themselves the United Nations of Earth. How optimistic." A Draconian captain, subordinate, lesser, but still capable, spoke from her station. "Admiral, the humans have requested we identify ourselves. They claim to be willing to negotiate." Varkon's claws scraped against the armrest of his command throne. Negotiate. The word carried no weight in his language. There was no equivalent. When strength met weakness, there was only one outcome. "Ignore them," he commanded. "Let them see us. Let them understand the futility of their position. I want Earth's governments to witness our arrival before we take their world. Fear is a useful tool. It makes conquest cleaner." The fleet pressed forward, and across the void, on a small blue marble called Earth, humanity held its breath. For the first time in recorded history, all of humanity stood together. Not as nations, not as religions, not as competing interests, but as one species facing annihilation. Dr. Sarah Chen stood in the United Nations Command Center in Geneva, surrounded by the brightest minds Earth had ever produced. Military strategists, scientists, engineers, diplomats, all of them staring at the same data, the Draconian Armada, closing the distance, unstoppable and inevitable. "Their individual ships are 30 times our size," one general said, his voice hollow. "Our entire nuclear arsenal is less than 1/10 of their destructive capacity. We have no defense." The words hung in the air like a funeral knell. But Sarah Chen was not a military officer. She was a physicist. She understood things that weapons specialists often forgot. The universe obeyed rules, and rules could be exploited. "What about the wormhole resonance patterns we discovered last year?" she asked quietly. The room fell silent. One of her colleagues, Dr. James Morrison, an astrophysicist of considerable renown, slowly looked up from his console. Understanding bloomed across his face. "The destabilization cascade," he whispered. "You're talking about accelerating the decay of the spatial anomaly near Titan. Would it work?" asked Secretary General Adeyemi, leaning forward. "It would create the largest localized distortion in spacetime this sector has ever seen," Sarah said carefully. "Anything caught within the cascade would be scattered, displaced. The probability of reconstitution depends on mass and molecular cohesion. Large objects, ships, would likely be torn apart across multiple dimensional states simultaneously. How long would it take to prepare?" Sarah looked at James, and he looked at the calculations flickering across his screen. Hours passed as they worked. The Draconian fleet drew nearer. 56 hours remained when the first volunteer stepped forward. Captain Marcus Webb had spent 20 years training to fly humanity's fastest spacecraft. The Aurora, a marvel of human ingenuity and desperate engineering, had been designed as a deep space reconnaissance vessel. It had never been intended as a weapon. "Someone has to pilot the resonance amplifier to the epicenter," Marcus said simply. "It has to be activated manually. The remote systems won't have enough precision." "We can send a drone," someone suggested. "No," Sarah said quietly. She had run the numbers herself. "The cascade begins in exponential waves. A drone's response time won't be fast enough. We need someone who can judge the moment, who can activate it at exactly the right instant. Someone who can adapt in real time." Everyone understood what she was saying. Someone who was willing to die for the human race. Marcus Webb smiled, a sad human smile. He thought of his daughter, 8 years old, back home in California. He thought of the billions of people depending on his choice. He thought of all the things humanity had built, all the art and music and love that would be erased if the Draconians succeeded. "I'm going," he said. 26 hours remained when Marcus undocked from the shipyard and jumped toward the coordinates Sarah had given him. The aurora gleamed silver against the black, a tiny needle approaching a cosmic storm of its own making. The Draconian fleet was close enough now that humans could see them with the naked eye, dark shapes crossing in front of distant stars, blotting out the light. Admiral Varkon detected the human vessel the moment it jumped to faster than light speeds. His strategic systems classified it instantly. Obsolete, minimal firepower, no threat. But aboard the Aurora, Marcus Webb was running calculations of his own. The Titan anomaly was a rent in spacetime itself, a wound in reality left over from the Big Bang. Sarah's team had discovered it was unstable, requiring only a certain frequency of energy to accelerate its decay. They had built the amplifier from humanity's most advanced technology. Crystalline structures that could project coherent waves through dimensions humans could barely understand. The specifications were extreme. The amplifier could only function if someone manually adjusted the output 17 times during the cascade sequence, each adjustment requiring a physical presence in the radiation chamber. Each adjustment meant exposure to radiation that would be lethal within hours. Marcus had volunteered knowing all of this. He had volunteered understanding that he would not be coming home. 12 minutes to Cascade Point. His instruments reported in that calm, synthesized voice. "Copy that," Marcus said, his own voice steady. He thought about his daughter again. He thought about how humans had always been willing to sacrifice. It was woven into the fabric of their existence. Parents sacrificed for children. Soldiers sacrificed for nations. Now, one man would sacrifice for his entire species. 3 minutes to Cascade Point, the instruments began reading massive gravitational anomalies in local spacetime. The Aurora's hull groaned as forces that human physics was still barely learning to understand began to converge around him. 2 minutes. Marcus left his chair and made his way to the radiation chamber. The first adjustment required him to manually interface with the amplifier's primary crystal matrix. The radiation was already beginning. He could feel its heat, though that wasn't quite the right word. It wasn't heat. It was wrongness. It was his cells screaming as energy tore through them. He made the adjustment with steady hands. 1 minute. The astronomical phenomenon he was racing toward appeared on every sensor simultaneously. The Titan anomaly was beginning to destabilize. The cascade was starting. And at the other end of the spatial distortion, the Draconian fleet maintained its course toward Earth, unaware that the universe itself was about to transform into a weapon. Marcus made the second adjustment. The radiation alarm became a constant wail. 30 seconds. He could no longer feel his hands. This was expected. He had studied the projections. 15 seconds. The amplifier crystal began to sing, a frequency that existed in multiple dimensions at once. Outside, the tear in spacetime began to grow. It began to warp. It began to expand. The radiation exposure had reached levels that should have killed him minutes ago. But adrenaline and purpose were keeping him upright. They were keeping him moving. 5 seconds. The Draconian fleet saw it. The spatial anomaly exploded into being, but not as a simple explosion. It was a cascade of dimensional folding, a wave of spacetime distortion that expanded at impossible speeds. For the first time in the war that wasn't really a war, the Draconian sensors registered genuine alarm. Admiral Varkon's command throne shook as his instruments screamed warnings. "All vessels execute emergency jump protocols," he roared. But it was too late. The wave of spacetime cascade was moving faster than light itself. The laws of reality were quite literally being rewritten in that region of space. The Dominion's Fong vanished. Then the Devourer went dark. Then the Conqueror. Then dozens, then hundreds of Draconian capital ships, the most advanced military vessels in the known galaxy, were caught in the expanding wave of cascading distortion. Some were torn apart across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Some were scattered across light years, their crews facing a death of decompression or radiation. Some simply ceased to exist in any conventional sense, scattered across dimensional states that no sensors could track. When the cascade finally subsided, Admiral Varkon was no longer in this universe. Neither was his fleet. Neither were they entirely gone. They were scattered. They were displaced. The probability of rescue was essentially zero. The Draconian Empire would search for 10 years and find nothing. They would find particles. They would find wreckage. But they would never find the fleet that had been sent to conquer Earth. In the Aurora, the instruments fell silent. Marcus Webb had completed 17 adjustments. His body was failing. His vision had gone dark. His lungs were filling with fluid. His heart was beginning to fibrillate. But his hands had completed every task. He had saved Earth. The data that came through as the radiation finally claimed him showed the cascade sequence had completed successfully. All remaining human surveillance systems confirmed it. The Draconian fleet was gone. Completely. Totally. Earth scientists, watching from labs and command centers across the planet, began to comprehend what had happened. Sarah Chen sat in silence, tears streaming down her face. James Morrison had his head in his hands. But around the world, in cities and towns, in homes and schools, humanity let out a breath it had been holding for what felt like forever. The invincible Draconian Empire, conquerors of 10,000 worlds, had been broken by a single human sacrifice. Not broken militarily, broken strategically, broken, but more than that, they had been broken by witnessing something they could not understand. Across the galactic networks, the news spread like light across the void. Humans had defeated the Draconians. Not through superior force, not through lucky circumstance, but through sacrifice, through genius, through a willingness to give everything for their species. When the details emerged, when other civilizations learned that a single human had piloted a ship into certain death to trigger a cascade that would scatter an entire fleet, the Xylotians, who had considered humanity primitive, began to study human history with new respect. The Centauri Collective, who had dismissed humans as too chaotic to be reliable allies, began to reconsider their stance. The Vartak, who had never bothered to learn human names, suddenly wanted to know this Captain Marcus Webb. They wanted to know about the human who had smiled while walking into radiation to save his species. 6 months later, the United Earth Council commissioned a memorial. It stood in New Geneva, a crystal structure that caught the light and refracted it into colors humans could see and colors they could not. Inside, inscribed on the walls, were the names of every human who had contributed to the Cascade Project. And at the center, facing the stars, was a statue of a human in a pilot suit, hands raised to the heavens. Ambassador Sheldrak of the Xylotian High Council stood before the memorial, his crystalline form refracting the light. He was a being of pure logic, a creature whose species had advanced beyond what most would consider the limits of, but he was struggling to process what he was observing. "Explain this to me again," he said to Sarah Chen, who stood beside him. Captain Webb knew he would not survive. His biological functions would cease during the operation. And yet he volunteered. For his species. For beings he would never meet. "Yes," Sarah said simply. "This is inefficient. In strategic terms, a drone would have been more logical. The loss of a single drone is negligible." Sarah looked at the Xylotian ambassador, and she smiled, that same smile Marcus had worn before his final flight. "That's what we expected you to say," she said. "That's what everyone expected. But you see, you've misunderstood what happened. The cascade wasn't the weapon. Marcus Webb was the weapon. And his weapon was hope." Sheldrak fell silent. "You see," Sarah continued, When humans face impossible odds, we don't think about statistical probability. We think about our children. We think about art. We think about the future. We think about everyone who depends on us, and we find strength we didn't know we possessed. She gestured toward the memorial. Marcus Webb walked into death with acceptance and even peace, because he knew what he was saving. That knowledge, that purpose, changed everything. The Draconian Empire believed they were invincible. But invincibility fails when confronted with true sacrifice. It fails when confronted with meaning. The Xylosian ambassador considered this. His crystalline form shifted through colors, processing, analyzing, understanding. "I am beginning to comprehend," he said quietly, "why the galaxy has been underestimating your species." When the final analysis came in from the astronomical surveys, it painted a picture that would echo through the galaxy for generations. The Draconian fleet was not destroyed. It was not lost. It was scattered, displaced across dimensional rifts that might not collapse for centuries. And somewhere in those rifts, Admiral Varkon and his elite warriors were still alive, still conscious, probably still trying to understand what had happened to them. They had conquered 1,000 worlds, but they had been undone by a single human willing to sacrifice everything. And for the first time, the galaxy understood. The Xylosians understood. The Centauri understood. The Vartak, the Qualir, the ancient travelers, all of them understood in that moment. Humanity was not the strongest species. Humanity was not the most technologically advanced. Humanity was not the fastest, the largest, or the most powerful. But humanity possessed something that no algorithm could calculate, no database could quantify, no weapon could overcome. Humanity possessed the will to sacrifice, the courage to face the infinite dark, the capacity to die for something greater than themselves. And for the first time, the galaxy understood what it truly meant to be human. If the story moved you, if it reminded you of the strength that lives within the human spirit, then please subscribe for more tales of human courage from the stars. Because somewhere out there in the cosmos, the galaxy is still watching, still learning, still discovering what humanity is truly capable of.